We are doing chapter 11 from Never Let Me Go. So this is part 2, which is set at the cottages. So I want to talk first about the narrative. The phrase "I should explain" here. So at times Kathy does explain events, but at other points our knowledge is assumed. But it's really important that we remember that Kathy kind of frames the narrative, that she interjects at different points and qualifies points or admits that she might be biased. So while they're at the cottages, they display these really teen-like behaviours. They argue, they have a lot of sex, they also do a lot of reading, and they talk about a lot of philosophy, but underlying everything is kind of these really natural behaviours for teens. So we see their humanity here, okay? You know, sitting with each other, Ruth and Kathy, having hot drinks, talking about their deepest feelings. All that is evident of their humanity. They are far from just being all the same. This whole idea of sex at the cottages and this whole thing around who they're having sex with is really interesting. I think it's about the fact that they're kind of aware of their lives and they know they don't have children. So on one point, this whole thing is that there's this lack of intimacy attached to it. But I also think it's the ignorance. They talk about how it's explained while they're at Hailsham, but again, only partly explained. They're very much in the dark about many aspects of their lives, okay? I thought this comment about the blankets often weren't even blankets, but really an odd assortment of old curtains, even bits of carpet. Like the small detail, like the junk they kept as treasures, like that they're only really being given just what they need to survive and not a lot more. They certainly don't have a lot of comfort. So again, this idea that they're kind of pushed to the margins of society, and even though that their bodies save lives, not a lot of money or care is always given to these clones. I think the character of Ruth is really interesting. Like, is she deliberately trying to make Kathy feel bad, or is she lacking in understanding? And the reason I want to talk about Ruth a little bit is I think that we're deliberately set up by Ishiguro to dislike Ruth, and then comparatively we're set up to like Kathy. And I think that the difference is deliberate because he wants to show their humanity. And I think you can compare it to Funda and how the victims are presented as quite likeable while the perpetrators are presented as quite unlikable. So the narrative voice. The whole idea of Ruth needing to have the attention and focus, all right? They have unique identities, they're human, but Ruth always needs to be the focus. So the relationship dynamics are really important there, and revealing Ruth's characteristics and again her humanity. The whole idea of trust is important. So I put this under lost because, of course, Kathy's lost Hailsham and the protection there, so that all they really have at this point is each other. So they really have to place their trust in each other. And so this idea that their trust is betrayed becomes really significant because, again, it's like a piece of their past being cut off. Kathy acknowledging here that she is an unreliable narrator. She doesn't mean to be, and she acknowledges it again, but she only offers her viewpoint. So that makes her an unreliable narrator, although she does acknowledge that she is. I didn't finish my note here, but I was going to say, like, the whole idea that Ruth is out to impress, which I touched on before, I think it kind of comes up again in the idea of humanity, because Kathy doesn't seem to have that interest in impressing people, but Ruth does. So the difference in personalities reveals humanity. I say this is an explanation, but it only occurred to me recently. So again, like the retrospective narrative, so looking back, Kathy can highlight her own bias, but couldn't necessarily at the time. And then we have this whole idea of loss again with Ruth gets rid of everything that she had in her collection box and Kathy doesn't. But I think it's interesting that Ruth would have felt the loss as well, but she was trying to be grown up. She was trying to be what she thought she should be. And this is the whole idea of mimicking the TV, because they don't really know what their lives should look like or how they should behave, so they mimic what they see. again, with the box, Kathy keeps everything, her memories, she realizes are important. Okay, even as a young teen at the cottages, she knows her memories are important, whereas Ruth gets rid of it. Okay, the whole idea of we didn't really talk about it, so I just feel like secrecy or the lack of conversation and the fact they ignore a lot or a lot is left unsaid is really interesting. They kind of choose to live in ignorance. All right, they don't question things. I think subconsciously they know. um Again, the whole idea of the junk. So Kefers, who was the old caretaker, Ruth asked him to donate the stuff, and the implication is it's basically just junk. It's not even good enough to take to an op shop. So I think that's interesting that that's, what they have as their treasured possessions. All right. Again, we've got this difference between Ruth and Kathy. Kathy's not embarrassed by what she has. She knows that the collection is important to her and her memories, etc., and that that's going to give her a sense of hope. And I suppose also a sense of belonging, which will help her in the future, whereas Ruth gets rid of it to try and fit in. I thought this was really interesting on my second read, this whole idea about not mentioning other students. I was like, is this because they're aware of the fate of these donors, so they don't really want to face the reality. So that's why they're not talking about people who have left the cottages, because chances are they've already started their donations and have obviously become one step closer to completing. So they just kind of ignore their reality, their future, until they actually are there dealing with it. And the whole idea of no one really asking anything when they've come back from doing their training. So there's this real denial of the future. It kind of exists while their children are Hailsham as well. It's kind of like, just don't acknowledge it, because again, the inhumanity of what is happening is quite significant. So although they don't rebel, they kind of just try and suppress what's happening. We've never come across anything like that before, and we didn't know what to think with regards to the porn magazines. So looking back, Kathy realizes kind of how much they didn't know and how ignorant they were, and there's this real lack of general education, and there's no one to act as a role model for them. And they have the guardians, but we know that the guardians are quite distant. And at the end, Miss Emily even admits that to an extent the guardians were repulsed by the clones, so they're really on their own with figuring things out. And I think this theme comes up here again with the lack of education, the lack of role models, when she's looking for her, I forgot the word, like her possible, in the porn magazines. Like she's trying to figure it out for herself. She doesn't have a sound understanding of what's happening, and she doesn't, I suppose these clones don't really have anything to go off. So they're just, fudging it out themselves, trying to work it out, continually. And then Tommy kind of acknowledges this. He's fairly perceptive, and he knows Kathy's looking for something. He might not know that she's looking for her possible, but he knows that something is off. So again, the character notes about Tommy being perceptive. And then again, this retrospective idea of memory, that like looking back at her memory, like remembering back at that time, Kathy can kind of see that she hadn't worked things out for herself, but she wouldn't have had that when it was actually taking place. So that was chapter 11 of part 2.